James chapter 4, beginning in verse 11. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is only one lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Well, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live to do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You've laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You've lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You've fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Please be seated. As I was reading through the book of James in preparation for this talk today, I began to wonder how long James would keep his job if he were preaching in one of our churches. Because James is a straight shooter, isn't he? James calls them like he sees them. And all of what he has just told us in this passage comes on the heels of him saying in chapter 4, verse 7, submit yourselves, therefore, to God. And then he proceeds somewhat systematically to let them know all the ways in which they're not doing a very good job with that. This section is in particular about more sins of the tongue and about judgment. There are people in the churches saying evil things about one another. There are people in the churches judging their brothers and sisters. And James has to say, look, there's only one judge. There's only one who is able to both save and destroy the souls of men, and that one ain't you. Who are you, James asks, that you can judge a brother? And then James goes on to remind the church of three pretty important things. I think these are good reminders also for us this morning. First of all, he says, remember, life is short. James says we don't know what the morrow will bring. We go around making our plans for the future when the fact is tomorrow may not even get here. My favorite weather guy on TV is Jim Spencer on KXAN. And I think it's just because he seems to know what he's talking about. But there are times when he predicts rain and we get sunshine. There are times he calls for a sunny day and we get showers. But James, the brother of Jesus, is forecasting a light mist for all of us, a light mist that is here today and gone tomorrow. And brothers and sisters of the faith, that's a forecast that is accurate 100% of the time. You are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. I'm reminded of the morning fog here in central Texas. In the wintertime, you can almost wave your hand in front of your face and not be able to see it. But by 10:30, beautiful day. And some of the folks in the church that James is writing to are business people, and their businesses have really started to do well, and they've begun to make big plans. They're thinking about early retirement, and James says, hang on, before you think about early retirement, you might want to think about early expirement, because we all have an expiration date, don't we? I don't know if you've been to that website called deathclock.com. I'm a little bit afraid to go there. You answer a few questions about your health and your weight, your height, your age, your family's health history, and you push a button and it spits out the date and time that you're going to die. And you press another button and the countdown rolls on. And James might say, that might be a pretty good clock for you to carry around with you, to remind yourself that you're only here for a little while. Psalm 90 verse 12 says, teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. See, when we accept our own brevity, there's wisdom to be gained, the wisdom that Dr. Napier talked about last week, the wisdom that comes from above. When we accept our own brevity, we become better decision makers. James also reminds us that God is sovereign. Verse 15 again. You ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. My sweet grandma, Minnie Klepper of Clyde, Texas, died in 1965. I only knew her for 7 years. And still, I wish I had a nickel for every time I heard her say, Lord willing. We've gotten away from that, haven't we? Understand, there's nothing wrong with making plans. In fact, the Bible commends it. Proverbs 21:5, the plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. See, God expects us to use our head as more than a hat rack. He expects us to think for ourselves. But James reminds us, don't have such a certainty over tomorrow that it trumps the sovereignty that God has over tomorrow. Make your plans, recognizing that you are a finite being and that our God is eternal. One of my vices is watching too much golf on TV. But hovering above the golf course is always the MetLife blimp. Snoopy 2, they call it. It's got a picture of Snoopy on the side and great big words for the if in life. We need to be reminded that life has a great big if in the middle of it, don't we? And most of the time, that if is not up to us. That's the property of God. Psalm 115 verse 3 says, our God is in the heavens and He does all that He pleases. I don't know that there's a better reason to put the words, if the Lord wills, back into our vocabulary than that. God does what He pleases. And we would do well to accept that. Paul certainly did. Acts chapter 18, the Ephesian Jews are wanting Paul to hang around a little while. And he said, I'll come back and I'll see you again, if the Lord wills. 1 Corinthians 16, Paul writes, I do not want to see you now just in passing. I hope to spend some real time with you, if the Lord permits. See, when we accept God's sovereignty, it frees us up to be, today, who God would have us to be as we go about doing good to others in His name. And really, I think that's the last reminder from James. He reminds us that the right time for doing the right thing is right now. God is sovereign over both the future and the present. Verse 17, so whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. See, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't even know if tomorrow is going to get here. But I know that God is sovereign. And I know that I am accountable to Him. So if there is something good and right that needs to be done, it needs to be done right now, because for me not to do that is an offense against Him. And I believe that's what James continues to flesh out there in the first 6 verses of chapter 5. He's talking to these rich business owners. They're hoarding money that should have already been paid out to the workers. Work has already been done, and they would say, James, hang on, man. We'll get around to paying those guys, but our businesses are starting to take off, and we're going to go here and here and here. We've got big plans for what's going on. They'll get their money. And in the meantime, their bills go unpaid because the boss is hoarding the paychecks. And ultimately, those workers will be thrown into prison, won't they? Because they haven't paid their debts. All because these greedy business people know what they ought to do, and yet they refuse to do it. And that's a sin. And in fact, James calls it murder, doesn't he? You're killing these people. You think you're storing up judgment for all your plans, but all you're really doing is storing up judgment on yourself, and it is your money that is testifying against you. The last 2 or 3 years in our society, we've kind of grown fond of talking about the one percenters. And even we in this room might say, oh yeah, soak those people. They'll never miss it. But the truth is, and those of you that have done mission work already know this, on a global scale, everybody in the room is rich. And how often do we know the right thing to do, and yet we procrastinate? James says that delayed obedience is really disobedience. We say, yeah, I'll do that someday. I'll do that when. I'll do that then. But folks, when and then are not the Lord of our lives. Jesus is. And there comes a time when we know the right thing to do, and we know that it needs to be done right now because of what God has done for us through His Son. God's no procrastinator. In fact, God is always right on time. For you see, at just the right time, while we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. And so James says, remember, life is short. God is sovereign. And the right time to do the right thing is right now. May God bless you today as you go about doing the right thing.